Thank you very much. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with woe? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as difficult as these questions are, many people have answers to them. For example, some people believe that morality is dictated by God in holy scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? In Enlightenment Now, I argue that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, namely the ideals of the Enlightenment, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. They've faded into the background as the status quo or the establishment. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals too need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I've tried to do. The ideals of the Enlightenment, I suggest, can be captured in 4 key ideas: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the realization that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you try to suggest that you are right, that other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you've appealed to reason. Now, humans on their own are not particularly reasonable. Cognitive psychologists, most notably Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, have shown that human beings are likely liable to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes, we all seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and blow off evidence that disconfirms them, and we're overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. However, people are capable of reason if they establish certain norms and institutions, such as free speech. Anyone can criticize the claims of anyone else, such as open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which brings me to the second of the Enlightenment ideals, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can understand the world by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be the most reliable way of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment ideal is that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. Now, science provides not just technical know-how and handy gadgets, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The universe has no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we've got to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system, one without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. And that's because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process which selects for reproductive success, not for well-being. As Immanuel Kant put it, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. This leads to the third Enlightenment theme, humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Now, that sounds pretty obvious. Who could be against human flourishing? And the answer is there are lots of alternative moral systems that prioritize other things, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical force, dialectic struggle, or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because humans are endowed with a sense of sympathy, another recurring Enlightenment theme. That is, we can be concerned with the welfare of others. We feel others' pain. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather puny. We tend to sympathize only with genetic relatives, with close friends and allies, with cute little fuzzy baby animals, and that's about it. But our sense of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, through education, journalism, art, mobility, and reason. I can't insist that my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. So when we're engaged in discourse, that forces us to expand our circle of sympathy to include others. The final Enlightenment ideal is progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, if human nature doesn't change, how could progress be possible? And an important answer from the Enlightenment is it's possible through benevolent norms and institutions, by which we can deploy energy and knowledge to combat entropy. We can magnify the better angels of our nature, such as reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our dominance, our vengeance. Examples of Enlightenment institutions, brainchildren of the Enlightenment, are democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, and a free press. So, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have learned that most intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, then you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, an allusion to the Voltaire character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Now, by today's standards, Pangloss would be categorized as a pessimist, because a real optimist would think that we can do much better than the world we find today. This is definitely not the best of all possible worlds. But the case for progress should not depend on an attitude, a temperament, whether you have a sunny disposition. It can be treated as an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. We can measure life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. I submit, if they have increased over time, that is progress. Now, in Enlightenment Now, I try to make the case with graphs, plotting measures of human well-being over time. Because of the constraints of this room, although I feel naked telling the story without graphs behind me, I'll have to do a combination of verbal description and pantomime to convey the same point. Well, let's begin with the most precious resource of all, life itself. Through most of human history, life expectancy at birth was around 30 years. But thanks to vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in health and medicine, life expectancy at birth today in the developed world is greater than 80 years, and in the world as a whole, 71 years. And virtually no one guesses that it is that high. Through most of history, the biggest hit to human lifespan has been child mortality. Indeed, even in a country as wealthy and advanced as Sweden, 200 years ago, about 1/3 of children did not make it to their 5th birthday. Today, in the poorest parts of the world, no more than 6% of children fail to make it to their 5th birthday. This would be sub-Saharan countries like Ethiopia, which just in the last 40 years have brought their rate of child mortality down from 25% to 6%. Still too high, but the improvement is continuing. Maternal mortality is another contributor to premature death, and in Sweden 200 years ago, 1% of mothers died in childbirth. That has been brought down now to 1/3 of 1% in the poorest countries of the world. And with most of the measures of well-being, unfortunately I can't depict it in graphs, but the general pattern that you see in measure after measure is that before the Enlightenment, about 250 years ago, pretty much everyone was wretched. There was universal poverty and hunger and early death. European and American countries were the first to make the great escape from universal poverty and early death, followed, though, recently by Asia, Southern Asia, and now sub-Saharan Africa is closing the gap. Health. As someone who has spent a good chunk of his career studying the grammar of the past tense in English, I can identify my favorite past tense sentence in the history of the language. And it comes from a Wikipedia entry for smallpox, and the entry begins, "Smallpox was a disease caused by two viruses." Yes, the definition is in the past tense because smallpox, which killed some 300 million people in the 20th century alone, has ceased to exist. And similar progress has been made, well, not quite similar yet, but other diseases are slated for the past tense, including polio and guinea worm, and even diseases that will not be extinguished are all coming down in their mortality rates. Pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. Starting with the agricultural revolution in Britain in the late 18th century, with crop rotation, other advances in agronomy, later synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of farming, selective breeding as captured in the Green Revolution, thought to have saved 1 billion lives, and transportation networks, the number of calories available per person has increased in every part of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa and India. Now, this would be a dubious form of progress if all those extra calories were just making fat people fatter. But in fact, undernourishment is being decimated. In 1947, approximately 50% of the world met the definition of undernourishment. That fell to about 33% in 1970, and it has come down in every part of the world. It's effectively zero in the developed world, but also coming down in Latin America, Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. As a result, famine, which was one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, which could strike any continent without warning for most of human history, has pretty much been banished except for the most remote and war-torn corners of the world. Prosperity. For most of human history, economic growth pretty much was non-existent. A tiny little increase until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, which initiated a blast-off of exponential growth with the result that gross world product increased about 200-fold in the last 250 years. Once again, this was an uneven process. It began with Europe and the Americas, thanks to the growth of education and technology and institutions that foster commerce and trade. But Again, this would be a dubious achievement if it simply made rich people richer again. But in a development that's seldom appreciated, the growth of prosperity is starting to put an end to extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is standardly defined as the minimum amount necessary to feed oneself and one's family. By that criterion, 200 years ago, about 90% of the world's population fit the definition of extreme poverty. That has now fallen to less than 10%, and the United Nations has set as one of its sustainable development goals the elimination of extreme poverty everywhere on Earth by the 2030s. May we all live to see that day. As a result of the decimation of extreme poverty, global inequality has been decreasing. Now, it's inevitable that with the Industrial Revolution and the first expansion of wealth, that inequality must have increased, because before the Industrial Revolution, everyone lived in squalid poverty, pretty much. With the discovery of new sources of wealth from industrialization, it meant that some people escaped from extreme poverty, leaving others behind, therefore increasing global inequality. But more recently, because of globalization and trade and markets, poor countries have been getting richer faster than rich countries have been getting richer, and the global inequality index has been decreasing. Now, of course, within wealthy countries, like the United States and Britain, inequality has been increasing. But perhaps what's more relevant is not so much the gap between the rich and poor, but the situation of the poor. Not so much whether everyone has the same, but whether everyone has enough. And in a revolution that is seldom appreciated, there's been a massive expansion in the amount of social spending, that is, reallocation of wealth to the poor, the sick, the young, the old, in every developed country. It's even has a name called Wagner's Law. For most of history, even the wealthiest countries devoted perhaps 1% of their GDP to social spending. Today, the median is 22% of social spending. And even a country like the United States, which is behind the Western average, allocates 19% of its GDP to social transfers. Thanks to these social transfers, while inequality has increased, poverty has not. By the measure of disposable income, that is, after taxes and transfers, the poverty rate in the United States has fallen by one measure from about 30% in 1960 to about 6% today. And if it's measured by consumption, by what people can afford in food and clothing and shelter, the poverty rate today is less than 3%. Peace. For most of modern history, war is the natural state of international relations, and peace was a mere interlude between wars. I have a graph from a previous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, which shows the percentage of years that the great powers of the day, the major states and empires, were at each other's throats in major wars. And it goes from about 100% in the 16th century to 0% today. There has not been a great power war directly pitting two great powers against each other since the United States faced off against China 60 years ago. If we zoom in on the post-war period, we see that another unheralded development, which is, with ups and downs, the global rate of death in warfare has been dramatically decreasing. During the era of the Korean War, about 20 per 100,000 people per year died in war. That went down to about 9 or 10 in the 1960s during the Vietnam War, about 5 in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Today, even with the worst war in a generation, the Syrian civil war, it's about 1.2. With the signing of the peace agreement between the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrillas, the last war in the Western Hemisphere came to an end. So we're living in an era in which an entire hemisphere is free of war. And indeed, 5/6 of the world's surface is now free of war. Freedom and rights. Despite obvious backsliding in Russia, in Turkey, in Venezuela, and just today in China, the overall trend towards democratization has not been reversed. The world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. In 1971, the world only had 31 democracies. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. Even in Western Europe, Spain and Portugal were fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta. Most of Latin America was under the control of military governments. Taiwan, South Korea, all dictatorships. Today they have all become democratic, and from 31 countries in 1971, today 103 countries are democracies, comprising about 2/3 of the world's countries and 2/3 of the world's population. Within countries as well, the power of governments to brutalize their citizens has been gradually curtailed. Capital punishment, which used to be pretty much universal, has been abolished in country after country. If current trends continue, they probably won't, but if you were to extrapolate the line for abolitions of capital punishment will vanish from the face of the earth in about 10 years. In another development, in country after country, homosexuality has been decriminalized. It used to be a criminal offense in just about every country, and every year another couple of countries decriminalize homosexuality. Child labor. In England in the mid-19th century, the era immortalized by Dickens in Oliver Twist, for example, about 1/3 of the children were put to work in farms and factories, thanks to the premium on education, mechanization of agriculture, and an increased valuation of the lives of children. That went down to pretty close to zero, a trajectory that is now being replicated in the world as a whole. In 1950, also about 30% of the world's children were put to work. Today, it is now 10% and continuing to fall. Kailash Satyarthi won the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago for his efforts, hugely successful in bringing down the rates of child labor. Violent crime. In the homicide statistics in many parts of the world go back 800 years to the Middle Ages. And in the 14th century, the homicide rate in England and Netherlands and other European countries was in the order of about 35 per 100,000 per year. Thanks to the frontier regions being brought under the control of the rule of law and the anarchy and the code of vendetta being replaced by a criminal justice system, that rate has fallen to about 1 per 100,000 per year, a 35-fold reduction. That is a process that seems to be replicated whenever frontier regions are brought under the rule of law. The same thing happened in New England when the anarchy of the frontier fell under the rule of law. Same thing happened in the American Wild West, made famous by the cowboy movies. And even parts of the world that today remain notorious for their high rates of violence, like Mexico, have had a 5-fold reduction compared to the rate of violence in the 1930s. That process has continued in the United States, which in rates of violence, as within many other areas of human flourishing, the United States is kind of a backwater when it comes to wealthy democracies. In pretty much every measure of human flourishing, we fall behind our democratic peers. Most notably homicide, where our rates of homicide have been between 5 and 10 times that of European countries. But even in the United States, the rate of homicide has fallen by more than half in just the last 25 years. It's not just the most extreme crime, namely homicide, that has shown reductions, but the rate of rape in the United States has fallen 75% since the 1970s. The rate of domestic violence has plummeted, and the victimization of children in schoolyards, in the home, rates of bullying, rates of physical abuse, rates of sexual abuse have all gone down. Indeed, we have become safer in just about every other way that you can imagine. Thanks to advances in the design of automobiles and highways, better licensing requirements, better traffic law enforcement, we are 96% less likely to die in a car crash compared to the early 20th century. We're 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 92% less likely to be burned to death, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. There's one exception to this trend. And if I were to be able to show you the graph, you'd see a bunch of curves all going down for various accidental causes of death, but one of them going up. And that is the category that public health experts call death by poison, solid or liquid. At first, when I saw that curve, I wondered why people were suddenly drinking bleach or eating rat poison, but it turns out that that is the category that includes drug overdoses, and the opioid epidemic is one category of safety that has gone dramatically in the wrong direction. However, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job, and we're globally far less likely to be killed in an act of God, in a earthquake, a brush fire, a volcano, a flood, a famine. What about the quintessential act of God? Everyone's favorite metaphor for an unpredictable date with death, the literal bolt from the blue, the thunderbolt hurled by Zeus. Yes, we are 96% less likely to die from a lightning strike compared to several decades ago. Knowledge. Through most of European history, no more than 15% of the population knew how to read or write. Today, that figure is 100% in the developed world. But in the world as a whole, the literacy rate has exceeded 80%, and for people under the age of 25, 90%. This is true not just for boys, as was traditional, but for girls. The world is approaching gender parity in literacy and in basic education. And in perhaps the most incredible example of human progress that I have come across, one that still strains most people's credulity, we are getting smarter. In a well-replicated effect called the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing by 3 points a decade for almost a century, thanks mostly to the spread of education, probably also because of the rise of public health, and probably also the spread of symbols and abstract concepts into everyday life, trickling down from science, academia, and technology. Well, does any of this bring any gains in quality of life? All these things that economists like to measure and quantify? Well, by pretty much any definition of quality of life, yes. For example, as Charles Dickens reminded us in A Christmas Carol, in the 19th century, people worked about 65 hours a week. That has fallen by 22 hours a week. And most workers today get 3 weeks of paid vacation in addition to the reduced work week. In the domestic sphere, we used to spend about 60 hours a week on housework, and by we, that really means women, since housework traditionally and to a large extent today is gendered. But thanks to the ubiquity of electricity, running water, and labor-saving devices like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, dishwashers, and stoves, which a majority of households have, including a majority of poor households, the amount of time that we lose to housework has fallen from about 60 hours a week to about 15 hours a week. And in fact, an entire day of a week of one's life, it used to be called wash day, a day in which women did nothing but wash clothes, has been returned to our lives. Thanks to the reduction in the work week and the reduction in housework, leisure time has been increasing even since the 1960s, putting aside the gains from the early 20th century. If you were to see the graph, you'd see one anomaly, which is that the amount of leisure time for men has steadily increased. The amount of leisure time for women increased through the early 90s and then kind of leveled off. And the reason is that women spend more time today with their children. In fact, a single working mother today spends more hours a week with her children than a married stay-at-home mom spent in the 1950s. So forget Leave It to Beaver. We also spend less of our paycheck on necessities. In 1920, people had to fork over more than 60% of their paycheck to food, clothing, and shelter. Today, it's less than a third. Well, does any of this make any difference for our happiness? And the answer is, it does. In a majority of countries for which we have longitudinal data that tracks happiness over time, there's been an increase. The United States, by the way, is an exception. The United States, happiness has pretty much stagnated, although it hasn't gotten worse. And more generally, if we step back and we look at the effects of economic development on happiness, if we look at the full range of the scale from poor countries to rich countries, then we see that there is a very strong but logarithmic relationship between GDP per capita and happiness, both across countries and within countries. So as the world gets richer, its people on average get happier. Well, has this all happened at the expense of the environment? Initially, it surely did, but in a development that few people appreciate, the environment is rebounding. And in a kind of report card for the state of the environment that done at Yale University, the Environmental Progress Index, 78 out of 80 countries have shown an increase in environmental quality in the last several decades. This includes the United States, where since the passage of the Environmental Protection Act in 1970, our GDP has gone up. The number of miles that we drive every year has gone up. Our population has gone up, but the rate of emission of air pollutions at the same time has gone down. So the idea that's popular both among the hard green left and the hard libertarian right, that you can have environmental growth or you can have you could have economic growth or environmental protection, but you can't have both, is false. We have had both, thanks to environmental regulation, which, needless to say, are currently under threat. In temperate parts of the world, deforestation has basically fallen to zero as farms have been abandoned and are reclaimed by forest. Even in tropical forests, where there's still an alarming amount of deforestation, the amount of deforestation has peaked and has come way down. We have to bring that to zero, but the direction is downward. As the world has shipped more and more oil by sea, there have been fewer and fewer oil spills, and more of the Earth's surface, both land surface and oceans, are now protected against economic exploitation. About 15% of the world's land area and about 12% of the world's oceans. Well, I've reviewed case after case of what one would have to call human progress. How is this reflected in the news? Well, one more graph that, again, I'm going to have to pantomime because I can't project it. A data scientist used the technique of sentiment mapping, which automatically analyzes news stories for degree of positivity, positive words and negative words. And what it has shown is that the New York Times has gotten pretty much more and more morose over time. That's not just the New York Times. A sample of the world's news sources shows the same increasing gloominess. So why do people deny progress? One answer comes from an interaction between the nature of human cognition and the nature of journalism. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman identified a shortcut that the human brain takes, a rule of thumb by which we assess probability and risk and danger, called the availability heuristic. Namely, the easier it is to recall examples from memory, images, anecdotes, narratives, the more likely we think something is. Well, now think about how the news works. News is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a reporter saying, here I am reporting live from a city that has not been struck by terrorists today, or a school that has not been shot up, or a country that has been at peace for 40 years. As long as the number of bad events hasn't fallen to zero, there will always be incidents to report on the news. You combine that with the availability heuristic, and you get the impression that the world is getting more dangerous and always has been. There are other psychological quirks that I think inflate our sense of dread and doom. In a phenomenon sometimes called the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we savor gains. We worry more about threats than we appreciate improvements, lead to not only a sense that the world is always a dangerous place, but it kind of opens up a niche for professional curmudgeons and doomsayers and prophets to remind us of threats that we may have overlooked. Indeed, this sets up a kind of perverse prophecy market where the gloomiest, most morose prophets are the ones to which we accord the greatest moral seriousness. As Morgan Housel, the financial writer, put it, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Okay, let me conclude with three general questions about progress and enlightenment. One might reasonably ask, isn't it good to be pessimistic? Isn't it important to rake the muck, afflict the comfortable, speak truth to power? Well, it is up to a point, but really what's important is to be accurate. That is, to be aware of problems and suffering and injustice where they occur, but also to be aware of ways in which they can be reduced. Because there are dangers to thoughtless pessimism. One of them is fatalism. Why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? Why throw money down a rat hole trying to alleviate poverty in the developing world if the poor will always be with you? It's precisely the conviction that we can improve, solve problems, that gives us the confidence to solve the problems that remain. Also, thoughtless pessimism can give rise to radicalism, that if every institution is failing, if all our problems are intractable, if society is just spiraling downward, circling the drain, then we may as well raise the institutions of modernity, smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, empower a leader who promises only I can fix it, and out of the hope that anything would be better than what we have now. Well, that can be, as history reminds us, that can be a dangerous kind of desperation, because the sentiment that things can't get any worse can be wrong, is wrong, given how much better things have become, even with the problems that remain. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. There is no magical arc bending toward justice or tide of rising human improvement that will make things better off all by themselves. Quite the contrary, the laws of the universe are indifferent to human well-being, and left to their own devices, things get worse, not better. Solutions create new problems which have to be solved in their turn, and we can always be blindsided by nasty surprises, and they do happen, like the world wars, the 1960s crime boom, the opioid epidemic in the United States. Also, there are severe global challenges that we have not yet solved. Prominent among them are climate change and the threat of nuclear war, an improbable but potentially catastrophic event. I think we are best off seeing these as problems that are unsolved but solvable. Climate change must be addressed by decarbonization via carbon pricing, including carbon taxes, and low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies. Denuclearization ought to be pursued via enhancing international stability and programs of threat reduction and arms reduction. The two more graphs, which I would show you if I was showing graphs, show that progress in both of these endeavors is by no means a utopian aspiration, but to some extent it's been happening. If you plot the amount of CO2 that countries emit per dollar of GDP, you find that there is an arc that Britain, for example, first country to industrialize, had huge carbon emissions when it relied on wood and then coal, but then less as it switched to oil and gas and renewables and nuclear. The United States followed the same U-shaped curve. China has repeated that trajectory, India, and the world as a whole. So industrialization is not inexorably committed to flaming carbon, but decarbonization is a process that has begun. It has to be accelerated much more. It has to be brought to zero. But those graphs suggest that it is not impossible. Likewise, few people are aware that the world's nuclear arsenal has been reduced by 85% since the height of the Cold War. Indeed, about 10% of American energy comes from nuclear power from decommissioned Soviet weapons. Again, that ideally should be brought to zero. Final question that I'll raise. Does the Enlightenment somehow go against human nature? This is a frequent accusation from defenders of religion and nationalism, that humanism all sounds very good, but isn't it kind of arid or tepid or a flattened view of human life? As if the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance is boring. Do people need to believe in magic, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies have proven themselves to be the happiest and healthiest places on earth, probably in the history of our species, and they're the top destination of the people who vote with their feet. Also, I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing, when properly appreciated, is heroic, glorious, and, I dare say, spiritual. Thank you very much. Thank you. Have I used up all the time, or is there time left for questions?
We've got some time for questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and I will come to you. I do have a Q&A mic here. We'll get to as many folks as we can. And folks, please do keep your questions to questions. Thank you.
Hi. Stephen, I have a lot of admiration for you as a public intellectual. You write some great books to read, and I'm not about to argue with your statistics on human history. However, I think your unfettered optimism is a bit irrational. I think it was Martin Rees who said, a good way to figure out how long things are going to last is to see how long they've lasted. And the Enlightenment and modern Western civilization is only a couple hundred years old. I was looking at the curve you had of GDP, and it feels like it's just going against the thermodynamic and probability gradient. It just feels like you're going to just fall off. So do you think, do you think that don't you think maybe this is a local maximum? And that with the uncertainty of climate change and artificial intelligence, that all bets are off?
Well, a few things. There's no law of physics or the universe that says that GDP growth has to level off or stop, because GDP isn't about stuff. GDP is about things that people value. And in particular, as with the advance in technology, we get more and more human benefit with fewer and fewer atoms. I mean, our smartphone has replaced something like 50 appliances. Most wealthy countries have reached peak stuff. That is, we consume less timber, less steel, less of every resource. But life keeps getting more and more interesting because we just process bits on our cell phone. So GDP, there's no law that says that GDP has to level off. That is a myth. Climate change indeed is an unsolved problem, as I mentioned, and maybe we won't solve it, but maybe we will. Paths towards decarbonization have been laid out. There is no law of physics that says that we cannot solve the problem. There may be a lack of political coordination and will, but there's plenty of photons that hits the world's surface from solar energy. There are plenty of opportunities from nuclear energy to supply the world's energy needs, even with exponential growth continuing into the future. In terms of the long run, like the very long run, well, yeah, the sun's going to expand into a red giant. It's going to boil away our oceans. We are going to die. In the long run, we're dead. And so there is undoubtedly a local maximum in the span of millennia, hundreds of millennia, millions of years. But I mean, there could be. You can't say that there isn't. But none of the arguments that there are, I think, holds water. And I think the threat of runaway artificial intelligence, I haven't mentioned that tonight, but I do discuss it in detail in the book, is completely fanciful. I think it's like the fear that many of us remember of the Y2K bug. Now, if you remember in 1999, everyone remember how nuclear missiles were going to launch from their silos, planes were going to fall from the sky, nuclear power plants were going to melt down. I personally think that the threat from artificial intelligence is in that category. That's different from the threat of nuclear war and climate change, which I think are real, are serious, are unsolved, but might be solvable. But I'm not worried about robots.
Got a question over here.
So first off, thanks for coming today, and thanks for the great talk. If the mainstream media is negative in nature, then does that mean there's a trade-off between being happy and being informed, even if we're consciously knowing it's going to be negative?
Yeah, there is something of a trade-off, and I do discuss that in the chapter on happiness. That one of the reasons that I speculate, because no one knows the reason, why, given the rising objective fortunes of Americans, why is our happiness stagnated? And in some ways, the percentage of Americans who call themselves extremely happy has gradually sunk somewhat. And some of it may be that as we become more aware of the world's problems, just as when we grow up and we become more mature, our worry burden increases. When we become grown-ups, we have to pay the rent and make a living and put food on the table. As a species, we have to now worry about things that a couple of generations ago people didn't worry about. Like in the 1950s, probably the peak of American influence and glory and standing. People didn't worry about racial inequality. They didn't worry as much as we do about nuclear war. I mean, there was the atomic cafe. There were atomic bombs were kind of cute in the early 1950s. Housewives enjoyed domestic bliss with all their appliances. Poverty was invisible. African Americans were invisible. And as we became more aware of American foreign policy blunders, of poverty, of environmental degradation, then I think it wasn't surprising that each one of us might add to our personal worry list some of the world's problems. I mean, now there are people who are anxious about climate change, even though there's nothing whatsoever that they personally can do about it. So you're right, I think there is something of a trade-off, and I think one of the challenges to us as individuals is how to be mature and responsible about taking the world's problems seriously without all of us worrying ourselves to death. And whether it'll be through mindfulness or meditation or cognitive behavior therapy or pharmaceuticals or advice from wise people, it is a challenge that we face as we grow up and become mature citizens.
Question over here. Go ahead.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Pinkert. I was wondering about what you thought caused the Enlightenment. So you can think of human history beginning a long time ago, but civilization being relatively new. But even in that span, it's only the 1700s that made people value science and humanism. So how could you think of those causes?
No, it's a great question, and as with all historical questions, the problem being that it only happened once, so we can't kind of rewind the tape and play it thousands of times and add up all of the different outcomes. And of course, there were predecessors to Enlightenment ideas in classical Greece during the Renaissance. So here's some possibilities. One of them is historical memory of the carnage of the wars of religion of the 16th and 17th centuries. And people realized that horrific results happen when you take your religious beliefs too seriously, and the Protestants massacred Catholics and vice versa. The scientific revolution of the 17th century showed people that age-old convictions could be flat wrong, and that the path to understanding had to be in applying reason, making beliefs tentative, subject to empirical verification. The age of exploration, the fact that entirely new continents came into people's consciousness, with all of these peoples doing things very differently than Europeans did, forcing you to step back, and the Enlightenment thinkers were kind of cultural anthropologists in appreciating the diversity of human cultures and saying, well, maybe things we've always taken for granted should be given another look. The final contributor may have been a technological development, namely the only industry that showed a huge increase in efficiency prior to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was publishing. So in the 18th century, the cost of printing a book and a pamphlet and distributing it plunged at the same time as literacy surpassed the 50% mark for the first time in European history, and ideas proliferated. Pamphlets and broadsides and treatises and manifestos kind of went viral by the standards of the day, which meant that they proliferated in a matter of weeks, not minutes, but still. And so there's a huge exchange of ideas, and concomitant with the exchange of ideas, people became more mobile. It was easier, if you were persecuted, you could hop on a ship and go to Amsterdam or to London when the heat got too high. And a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers were persecuted, but managed, instead of being beheaded, they found safe haven somewhere else. So the mobility of both people and ideas, I think, also played a role. Anyway, those are some conjectures.
We've got a question over here. Go ahead.
I really enjoyed the book and this talk, and I'm looking forward to your talk with Sam Harris. And my question is on the topic of artificial intelligence. You suggest in the book that the way to deal with the risk of malevolent, super intelligent AI that can't be turned off is simple: just don't build one. It seems to me like the intelligent people who are concerned about the risks of AI actually think it will be malevolent and tamper-proof, that it won't be malevolent and tamper-proof by design, but rather it would be an unintended consequence. Given the potential for good and profit, do you think that it's realistic to expect that simply not building one is a viable possibility?
Yeah, I do, because, and I have a pretty extensive discussion of it in a chapter on so-called existential threats. One of them is that we got to resist the temptation to think that as things get smarter, they get more ambitious and more malevolent. We kind of project human primate psychology on the concept of intelligence. And I think that it's inevitable as computers get smarter, they're going to want to control more resources. They'll see us as rivals. And that, I argue, is just a fallacy. Now, there's, I think, a more sophisticated argument, sometimes called the value alignment problem, that maybe they won't actually want to dominate us or displace us, but will be collateral damage for the goals that we do set them. So if we say, okay, robot, cure cancer, then it will draft us all as guinea pigs in fatal experiments, and there'll be nothing we can do about it. Or we say, increase happiness, and we train it on happiness with a picture of a smile, and it'll tile the universe with smiley faces and convert every atom in the universe into a smiley face. I think these scenarios are actually self-refuting. For one thing, they assume that we are going to be so brilliant that we'll design an artificial intelligence with the power to cure cancer, but so stupid that we'll give it control over all of our bodies and over all of society without thinking, well, gee, what could possibly go wrong? And that the intelligence itself will be so brilliant that it could devise experiments that would cure cancer, but so idiotic that it would interpret the goals that we set so literally that it would kill us all in the process. I think these are not just exotic, but I think just badly conceived scenarios. Even someone like Elon Musk, who I have tremendous respect for, who calls artificial intelligence a threat, well, why is he building self-driving cars? Isn't he worried that someone will program in, take me to the airport fastest route possible, and the car will just go on a straight line and mow people down on the sidewalk and crash through buildings? Well, he's not really worried about that, because he wouldn't build a car that would accept a command like that. And likewise, real artificial intelligence won't be built. First of all, we won't give it control over every molecule in the universe. The idea that intelligence will take off in such a unstoppable exponential process, I think, is falling victim to the current hype cycle in AI, which AI is always subject to, and that a lot of the current systems, for all their successes, are not as brilliant as they're made out to be. This is a widespread understanding about the people actually in the trenches of AI research. And also, these scenarios confuse general intelligence with Laplace's demon, the hypothetical entity that knows the position and velocity of every molecule in the universe and can predict what's going to happen by sheer cogitation, through sheer computation. Now, Laplace's demon is impossible for a variety of reasons, and what real intelligence consists of is interacting with the world by trial and error, empirically. And there'll always be a limitation of how smart a system can get based on how embodied it is, how connected it is to the real world of atoms. And so the fantasy of take off faster than we can control it, I think, is disconnected from the actual nature of intelligence.
We have time for just one or two more questions.
How about, I don't think we've had a single woman asking a question. So,
I'm
We
sorry,
have-
I've given it to this gentleman, but then I can pass the two of them.
okay.
Thank you. Huge fan of your work. I feel like a lot of us are saying, well, it sounds great, but what about X won't be, but what about X, won't X be terrible? Let me say it, what about X, won't X be terrible? I know you talked about the Flynn effect, the increase in intelligence, and how, I think you mentioned in the book that it's started to slow down. Is there any
It's definitely,
concern that may reverse? I mean, I'm thinking about studies about intelligence and number of children being inversely correlated in some Western countries. Is that a cause for concern?
Yeah, there's things that, I think it's called Davy's Law, things that can't go on forever don't. And the Flynn effect has absolutely leveled off in the countries in which it's gone on the longest. It won't keep increasing. Whether there'll be some dysgenic effect of, like the movie, anyone see the movie Idiocracy? That kind of plays out for comic effect. As best we can tell, that doesn't seem to be a strong effect. It doesn't seem to be certainly strong enough to reverse the Flynn effect going in the other direction. And the world contains, if you think about what percentage of the world has not had the opportunity to put its innate intelligence to full use. I mean, the percentage of people in Asia, in Africa, all these, the top 1% of the IQ distribution that has not gone to college or graduate school, that probably will in the next several decades if current trends towards education continue. There could be a massive recruitment of underused brain power across the globe that I think would swamp any kind of idiocracy scenario.
And perhaps our final or second to last question over here.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question for you is in relationship to your finding of the happiness factor being leveled off for us in the United States, correct?
Yeah.
And the CDC 2016 causes of death and the 2016 morbidity all correlate to what seems to be the stress factor. Our ways of Bruce McEwen's work with the stress cycle, allostatic load, and if it is not that what is going on is how we perceive that it is because of our negativity bias that we're always looking for worst case scenario and our inabilities. And the Earth Institute, Columbia's Earth Institute and United Nations did a sustainable happiness, what is the happiness factors, and the world factors that were identified were positive emotion, resilience, mindfulness, and pro-social emotions.
And freedom and GDP per capita.
Well,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In fact, those were the number one and number two. But yes, but those are also factors, all of them, right? Social trust, lack of corruption, yeah.
Yes. So that things to, and the thing regarding the news, I mean, that again, it's again towards the negativity factor, right? It becomes news because it's more the exception than it is the common factor for us.
Indeed, and I should emphasize that progress does not mean everything gets better for everyone always, because that would be magic. That wouldn't be kind of science-driven problem solving. And indeed, in the United States, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's definitely been a regression in a particular sector of the population, identified by Angus Deaton and Case, namely, mainly concentrated in less educated, more rural, baby boomer white men, where life expectancy has gone down, suicide has gone up, the life expectancy, there are enough of them that has dragged down the life expectancy for the country as a whole, kind of defying the pattern of the rest of the world. So this is an example of how there can be local reversals of progress, and indeed stress might be a contributor, the negative health effects of stress, because it's concentrated in sectors where there has been unemployment and underemployment, although it could also be more direct, namely the loss of health care and health benefits. Some of it self-inflicted because of the availability of opioids, some of it driven by suicide. So this is unmistakably a reversal of progress here in the in certain sectors of the United States, and one that it's imperative to address. But it's just an example of how progress doesn't happen by itself. We've got to identify the problems and solve each one in turn.
All right. I think it's time for the signing, unless you have any final comments. Big round of applause for Steven Pinker.
Thank you.
Just a moment. Just a moment.
Thank
Just a moment.
Thanks.